what I want to do now and for the rest of my time is just talk through four reflections 5 years on. So the first of these is this idea that the pandemic was a dialogical moment. When I set out to work on mass observations, COVID-19 collection, and to produce this edited collection, this book, I had some idea that other people were trying to do some similar things, but perhaps not as good an idea as I have now. So it turns out that my aim of producing a humanizing democratic account using diaries turned out to be part of a wider field populated by numerous other authors, editors, archivists, and researchers. The kinds of things I'm thinking of are the pandemic blogs of individuals that we might all have seen on the internet. Many corporations and media organizations during the pandemic ran series of pandemic diaries. Lots of archives, including the Mass Observation Archive, collected pandemic diaries during at least the first few months and perhaps the first year of the pandemic. And then there were numerous other research projects running in parallel to mine during this period, some of which I was aware of at the time, some of which I wasn't. So just a few examples. There was Michael Ward's Corona Diaries project run out of Swansea. The Young Foundation ran a project called the COVID and Me Diaries. A think tank called Britain Thinks had a coronavirus diaries project. There was Stay Home Stories, which was a project run between academics in London and Liverpool. The Lothian Diary project ran out of Edinburgh. So those are just some examples from the UK. I put an image up on the right of the screen of Nicola's book that Nicola will go on to talk about, which was a project I was unaware of, but shares many of the same concerns. And on the bottom right of the screen, I've put an image of something coming out of the public inquiry that I thought it was important to note. When I put my book together, one of the things I thought I was doing was adding something alternative to what the public inquiry would do, because the original terms of reference of the COVID-19 public inquiry was stated as its purpose was to produce a factual narrative account of the pandemic. So narrative, but factual. Over time, those terms of reference seem to have relaxed a little bit. And the COVID-19 public inquiry has developed a programme of work alongside its more prominent work. So its prominent work is hearing from politicians and medical advisors and so on about what was happening in terms of decision-making and so on during the pandemic. But running alongside that has been a programme of work called Every Story Matters, which anyone can submit material to. Many people have submitted their own pandemic diaries to. And then every so often, the public inquiry publishes what it calls records of these stories. So that to me is interesting. So that's the first point on the slide. The second point, the impact of these diary projects to date has perhaps been small. So we've just been through the first 5-year anniversary of the beginning of the pandemic. And my impression is it passed relatively quietly in British political and cultural life. I've been speaking over the last few years to a lot of fellow authors and also publishers, commissioning editors, politicians, policymakers about the pandemic and processes of memorialisation of the pandemic. And the general impression among most of those people is that there's an assumption people in the UK want to move on. Commissioning editors, publishers will say, if you want to say something or write something about the pandemic, come back on the 10th anniversary and people might be ready to hear about it, but they're not ready to hear about it yet. And perhaps these people have a point. The news has certainly moved on. Now, quite rightly, lots of people are interested in Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, inflation, Trump. An awful lot's happened in the past 5 years of great importance. We do, of course, need to remember, and it's always worth making this fairly obvious point, that the pandemic isn't over for everyone. There are still people out there suffering from long COVID. There are still many doctors and nurses out there suffering from PTSD. So that's a point I think always worth making. The third point on my slide is perhaps the time for these books we're talking about today, and also the diaries on which they're based, and all of those other diary projects too. Perhaps that time is yet to come. It strikes me that there's going to be a time, and it might not just be yet, where we really we really will need to have some help to remember the pandemic and what it was like and what people's experiences of the pandemic were like. And for me, that's the point of these books and the diaries behind them as much as anything. So one of the ways in which I think we can remember is through the details, and this is what the diaries are particularly good at. So one very brief quote that I'll read out from my book, and this is an extract from one diary in the book, just an example of a detail that I think really takes me back. So this is a woman, right? She's in her 60s, she's retired. We don't really know anything else about her other than that. And the extract is incredibly small. It's just a couple of lines from her diary. So she writes, "A book arrives in the post. We treat it with caution. Should we put it aside for 3 days until any virus on the packaging is dead?" So to me, someone who works with books every day in their lives, this idea that a book is to be treated as caution, or a book is to be treated with caution, really takes me back to the strangeness of those early months of the pandemic and reminds me of something that I'm in danger of forgetting. I also think the scope of the mass observation diary collection, what's in my book and what's also in Nicola's book, the sheer range of experience also helps us to remind us about, or it helps us to remember fully the experiences of the pandemic. I think otherwise, without these aid memoir, we end up focusing in on particular, sometimes quite obvious things, the experiences of the majority, for example, as opposed to the experiences of some people who perhaps weren't in the majority. So that's my third point. And then my final point on the slide, by way of reflections 5 years on, is like the pandemic, the diaries change things, especially for me. So when we think about the pandemic more broadly, not just the diaries, not just the books, but the pandemic as a whole, one question we need to address is, did it change anything? Were its impacts fleeting or long-lasting? So here are a few thoughts about that. On the one hand, it strikes me that much of what the pandemic opened up got closed down pretty quickly. So anyone who remembers what we all had to say about key workers during those first few months of the pandemic and the way in which key workers have been treated over the last 4 years or so, I think we'll probably agree that some things that got opened up by the pandemic got closed down pretty quickly. But not everything could be closed back down, I would argue. Things like the furlough payments during the pandemic set some expectations for how the state would respond to crises in the next few years. So when the cost of living crisis, as it was called, came along in 2022, there was a policy debate about things like cost of living payments and the energy price guarantee. And the policymakers I've talked to are very happy to say that that debate was informed by the experience of the pandemic. They were aware that citizens now expected, as a result of furlough, the state to protect people's living standards during moments of crisis. It's quite possible that those things wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. So not everything got closed back down. Another thing to say is that some things did change and haven't bounced back. So a lot of things have bounced back. There's just as much traffic on the roads now when I commute to Southampton as there was before the pandemic. But a lot of things haven't bounced back, and this has become clear from all of those think tank reports and journalist pieces over the last few months around the 5th year anniversary of the beginning of the pandemic. So in the world of healthcare, most of us now wait longer for treatment than we did before the pandemic, and that has not bounced back. In the world of education, attainment levels for most children haven't bounced back to pre-pandemic levels, nor have rates of participation or attendance at school. During the pandemic, the attainment gap between wealthy and poor kids increased, and that attainment gap has not narrowed since the pandemic. Many of us work from home more than we used to, although, of course, not everyone can do that. Economic activity among people in their 50s is lower since the pandemic than it was before the pandemic and hasn't bounced back. My sense is we probably don't talk enough in society about all of this. And I wonder just how much grief and stress is kind of lying underneath the surface as a partial explanation for some of these things, and also a partial explanation for perhaps why we haven't been talking about them that much either. So final couple of things that I want to say are, personally for me, working on the book and reading the diaries and going through the pandemic changed a couple of things for me in terms of how I think about certain aspects of my work. And I just wanted to very briefly mention two of them. One is social position. So I'm a trained social scientist. I grew up learning to think about social position in terms of the main sociological cleavages in society: class, gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, and so on. Reading the COVID-19 diaries during the pandemic, I was struck by how social position often couldn't be reduced to those classifications, even if we tried to think about things like intersectionality. Yes, it is the case that during the pandemic, certain social groups on average did much better or much worse than others in terms of outcomes. But often when I was reading the pandemic diaries, the most significant difference would be something that surprised me. Perhaps what was really dominating someone's experience of the pandemic was the fact that they lived and were locked down with a close relative whose dementia was gradually getting worse over the course of the lockdown. So I think partly this more complex idea of social position comes through when you're working with diaries, perhaps, instead of statistics and averages and so on. But I think also that the pandemic probably introduced some new opportunities and constraints into people's everyday lives, and some new social positions that followed from that. So I've been thinking a lot about that recently. Something else I've been thinking about since the pandemic over the last 5 years is the idea of luck. And this is my last main point before I'll conclude. So again, as a critical social scientist, I've been in the habit of treating luck either as superstition or as cover for privilege. And either way, it's always for me been something to explain and then to dismiss, really. But the pandemic diaries, reading the pandemic diaries, taught me a couple of things about luck, because lots of the diarists wrote about luck and related concepts like fortune and chance. Lots of the diaries are full of that kind of luck talk. So what I took from this was a couple of things. First, objective luck seemed to have been an important factor in shaping outcomes during the pandemic. So whether people caught the virus, died, had good or bad lockdown experiences, etc., were all partly a matter of things like structure or privilege, partly a matter of agency, but also partly a matter of chance, of being in the right place at the right time, of events happening beyond the expectations and control of participants. The other thing that I took from reading the diaries about luck was that people often narrated their pandemic in terms of luck. They described being fortunate and unfortunate. This was how they made sense of events often. It's also how they made sense of society and social stratification often. They wrote about the more fortunate and the less fortunate. So I've been thinking a lot more about luck as a prominent cultural resource during the pandemic and since the pandemic too. It's one means by which people make sense of the world. And as a cultural resource, it has potential, I think, as a political resource. So I've been thinking a lot about how people in everyday life talk about their lives in terms of luck, fortune, chance, and so on, on the one hand, and I've also been doing a lot of reading of political theory, especially people like John Rawls, who wrote a lot about the role of luck and fortune in life and used that as a central justification for their theories of things like policies to promote social justice, justifications for a welfare state, etc. as well. So I've been thinking a lot about that recently, and I don't think I would have been thinking about those things without having read these diaries, without the pandemic having happened. So just finally to conclude then, a few acknowledgements. Some of the work behind the book was funded by the British Academy. That funding actually came to two of us, myself and my close colleague Clive Barnett, who then died very suddenly in December 2021. So everything I do connected with this work is always dedicated to the memory of Clive. I also want to thank the archivists at the Mass Observation Archive, who were really helpful through this project, as they've been through every project I've worked with them on. So Kirsty, Jessica, and their colleagues. I need to thank the trustees at Mass Observation Archive for giving me permission to use all the extracts that are in the book. The diarists, of course, importantly. And then lots of people were very helpful as the book came to fruition. Ben, who's on the call, was really helpful as a critical reader. Rodri Mugford and his team at Bloomsbury were very helpful too. So those are the acknowledgements. And the final slide is the plug for the book. If anyone's on the call has been persuaded to buy it and doesn't yet have it, there's a discount code at the bottom of the slide. Bloomsbury tell me if you use Mass Observation 30 on their website, you can get 30% off, which will make it about, hopefully, affordable £14.